The house stood quiet, wrapped in the kind of silence that pressed down heavy on the chest. Emily paused at the gate, her hand tightening around the handle of the suitcase she had dragged behind her. She hadn't been here in years, not since she and her father stopped speaking more than they had spoken. Now the house belonged to her, not by choice, but by the cruel finality of death. Her father was gone. The thought repeated in her mind like a bell she couldn't silence. He had been sick for a long time, years of slow decline, each hospital visit stretching the distance between them. She had visited less and less, until eventually she didn't visit at all. When the call came 2 weeks ago that he had passed, her first reaction wasn't grief. It was something heavier, twisted with regret. She had let time slip by until there was none left. Emily pushed the gate open and stepped into the yard. The grass was overgrown, wildflowers climbing through cracks in the walkway. The house, once neat and proud, sagged in quiet neglect. She swallowed hard. It looked smaller than she remembered, as though the years had shrunk it down along with everything else in her life. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, and the faint smell of old books. She set her suitcase by the door and stood still, letting the memories flood back. Every corner carried echoes, the way her father's chair creaked when he shifted his weight, the smell of his pipe tobacco, the sound of his voice reading scripture at the table. But along with those memories came others she wished she could forget. The arguments, the slammed doors, the long silences that stretched for weeks. Emily had always believed her father loved her, but in the end, his love had felt buried under disapproval and distance. She walked into the living room, her fingers grazing the back of the couch. A thin layer of dust clung to everything. She imagined her father sitting there in his final days, the television flickering, the Bible resting on the table beside him. She tried to picture him as he must have been near the end, frail, fragile, perhaps lonely. The image filled her with guilt she didn't want to carry. Her eyes drifted toward the shelf stacked with photo albums. She pulled one out, brushing off the dust. The pages stuck slightly as she turned them, revealing images of birthdays, Christmas mornings, summer barbecues. In the photos, her father smiled, sometimes even laughed, holding her in his arms when she was small. It didn't match the man she had grown to know in later years. Looking at the photos, she felt like two fathers lived in this house, one who adored her and one who had pushed her away. Emily closed the album and set it back, her throat tightening. She didn't come here to dwell on what-ifs. She came because someone had to clean the house, pack his things, and face the ghosts left behind. Upstairs, she stepped into her old bedroom. The walls were still faintly painted in the pale blue her mother had chosen when she was 10. Posters had long been torn down, leaving faint marks of tape. The room felt like a museum of someone she barely remembered being. She sat on the edge of the bed, pressing her palms into the faded quilt. She had thought coming here would feel like duty, a cold task to cross off a list. Instead, the house stirred emotions she had buried for years. Grief came in small waves, quiet, unexpected, mixed with resentment that still stung. As she leaned forward, resting her face in her hands, a quiet truth settled in her heart. She didn't just lose a father to death. She had lost him long before, to silence, to secrets, to the kind of walls families build when words fail. The silence of the house pressed heavier now. Emily inhaled slowly, forcing herself to rise. There was work to do, boxes to fill, rooms to empty, a life to sort through. She didn't know yet that among the piles of dust and forgotten belongings, something waited for her, something that would not only explain the silence but break it wide open. With a steadying breath, she turned toward the hallway, her footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floorboards. The storm had not yet arrived, but it was coming. The next morning, sunlight streamed weakly through the dusty curtains, cutting narrow beams across the living room floor. Emily stood in the center of the room, surrounded by boxes she had dragged from the attic. It was overwhelming, the sheer weight of years pressed into cardboard. Every piece of paper and trinket tied to a memory she wasn't sure she wanted to revisit. She pulled open the first box, coughing as dust rose into the air. Inside were stacks of letters her father had kept, old bills, faded photographs. She picked up a picture of him as a young man, his arm around her mother's shoulders. They looked so happy, so alive in ways she barely remembered. The photo stabbed at her heart, stirring questions she couldn't answer. Piece by piece, she sorted, throwing out old receipts, setting aside items to donate. But every so often she stopped, holding something in her hands longer than she needed to. A pocket watch she remembered him polishing every Sunday, the faded baseball cap he wore when mowing the lawn, a coffee mug with a chip on the handle. Each object carried whispers of the man he had been. Some memories were comforting, but others cut deep, reminding her of the distance that had grown between them. As the hours passed, the silence of the house grew heavier. Emily turned to the bookshelf by the living room window, brushing her hand over the spines of books her father had read countless times. Among them, one stood out, the family Bible. It was thick, leather-bound, its cover worn soft from decades of use. She hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers tracing the faded gold letters. Her father had read from this Bible almost every evening. She remembered the sound of his voice, steady and commanding, as he recited verses at the dinner table. For him, it had been more than scripture. It was guidance, authority, a place he retreated when the world felt unsteady. For Emily, it had often been a reminder of the gap between them, a faith he clung to that she could never fully share. Still, something about the Bible called to her. She lifted it carefully, surprised at its weight, and placed it on the table. When she opened it, the pages crackled, edges yellowed and soft. Margins were filled with her father's handwriting, notes, underlines, passages circled for reasons only he would know. Emily flipped slowly, scanning the familiar verses, her chest tightening. It was strange to see his handwriting now, knowing it would never move across paper again. She felt as though he were reaching out from the past, speaking through ink and faded pages, and then something slipped. A folded piece of paper, thin and brittle with age, fell from between the pages of Psalms. Emily froze. The paper lay there, half hidden against the wood. She stared at it, her pulse quickening. Slowly, she reached down and picked it up. The edges were yellow, the creases worn from being folded and refolded. A letter. Her breath caught. For a moment, she wondered if she should put it back, leave it where it had been hidden. It felt wrong, like trespassing on something private. Maybe it was personal, meant only for her father's eyes. But then, why was it tucked away in his Bible, waiting? Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's. At the top, a name. Emily. Her heart pounded in her chest. The letter was addressed to her. Her first instinct was to stop, to fold it shut, and lock it away. Reading it felt dangerous, as if once she opened the door, she would never be able to close it again. She pressed the paper against her knee, torn between fear and longing. But curiosity, heavy and unstoppable, pushed against her hesitation. This was her father's voice, written years ago, speaking words he had never spoken aloud. She took a shaky breath and began to read. The letter was dated nearly 3 decades ago, when she had been just a child. Her father's words spilled across the page with a weight she had never seen in his voice. Confession, regret, something hidden just beneath the surface. He wrote of mistakes, of silence, of truths too painful to say aloud. Emily's throat tightened as her eyes moved down the page. Her father's pen bled with regret, about her mother, about choices that could never be undone. He hinted at something Emily had never known, something that made her chest tighten with both fear and disbelief. The room felt suddenly colder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She lowered the letter to her lap, her mind spinning. Whatever this was, it was only the beginning. And deep down, she knew nothing about her family, nothing about her childhood, was as simple as she had believed. Emily sat at the table, the letter trembling in her hands. She had read the first lines twice already, but the words refused to settle in her mind. Her father's handwriting, usually sharp and commanding, looked softer here, like he had written in a moment of weakness. She steadied herself and continued. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell you what I should have said long ago. I hope one day you can forgive me. Her chest tightened. Forgive him? For what? She read on, her pulse quickening with each line. The letter unfolded into a confession. Her father wrote about a time when he was younger, before Emily was old enough to understand the cracks forming in her parents' marriage. He admitted he had grown close to another woman, a woman from their church. Her name was Sarah. It started as friendship, he said, but crossed into something else, something he had sworn to God and to himself he would never allow. The affair ended quickly, but it left behind damage he could never repair. He returned to her mother, determined to bury the mistake and never speak of it again. But the mistake didn't stay buried. Emily, the letter read, I believe Sarah may have carried a child. I never asked, never faced the truth, because I was too ashamed. I thought if I kept silent, it would disappear. But the silence has followed me my entire life. It has followed us. Emily froze. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. A child? Another child? Her hands shook as she lowered the paper to the table. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle her father had left scattered across her childhood. The arguments between her parents that she never understood. Her mother's sudden silences at church gatherings. The way her father avoided certain names, certain conversations. It was as if her entire life had been a picture hanging on the wall, and now the frame had fallen, shattering into jagged pieces. She forced herself to keep reading. You deserved a father without secrets. But that is not the father I was. I carried this with me, and it made me distant from you. Every time I looked at you, I feared you would see my sin written on my face. I am sorry. I was weak. My greatest regret is not that I failed, but that I never told you the truth while I was alive. Please forgive me. The words swam before her. Emily pressed her hands against her mouth, choking back a sob. Forgive him? How could she? He had left her to grow up in the shadow of a lie. He had let her believe the distance between them was her fault, when in reality it was his own guilt building walls she could never break down. She pushed back from the table and stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. The house seemed to close in around her. She wanted to run, to escape the suffocating weight of the truth. But even as anger burned in her chest, something else stirred inside her, an undeniable pull toward the unknown. If Sarah had truly carried his child, then out there, somewhere, Emily might have a brother or sister she never knew existed. The thought was both terrifying and magnetic. She walked to the window, staring out at the yard where she had once played as a little girl. The swing still hung from the old oak tree, weathered and broken. How many moments of her childhood had been shaped by this secret? Had her father's stern silences, his distance, been less about disappointment in her and more about shame in himself? The memories came flooding back. The nights her mother sat at the kitchen table staring into her coffee in silence. The cold tension that often filled the air, broken only by raised voices when they thought she was asleep. The way her father sometimes looked at her as if he wanted to speak, but turned away instead. It all made sense now. Emily sank back onto the couch, clutching the letter to her chest. The anger inside her was sharp, but beneath it ran a deeper sorrow, a mourning not just for the man she had lost, but for the life that could have been, the childhood that might have been whole instead of fractured by unspoken truths. She whispered into the silence, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you just tell me?" The walls offered no answer. Only the letter, heavy in her hand, carried his voice. As the hours passed, Emily found herself reading the letter again and again. Each time, the words dug deeper, carving questions into her heart that would not rest. If Sarah's child was real, who were they? Where were they now? Did they even know? The thought of a half-sibling living a parallel life filled her with dread and longing all at once. It was a truth she couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wanted to bury it. Emily wiped her face and straightened the letter carefully, sliding it back into the Bible. Her father had tried to hide his secret, but in the end, the truth had found its way into her hands, and now it was her burden to carry. The silence of the house pressed heavier than ever, but this time Emily understood it. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was filled with the weight of everything her father had left unsaid. And deep down, she knew she could not leave it there. She had to know more. The storm had broken. The days after discovering the letter blurred together in a haze of restless thoughts and sleepless nights. Emily carried the folded pages with her everywhere, tucked carefully in her bag, as if it were both a burden and a lifeline. She read it over and over, searching for hidden meaning in her father's words. Each time, the weight grew heavier. He had betrayed her mother. He had hidden it for decades, and somewhere, out there, a child might exist, a sibling she had never known. She couldn't leave it alone. One gray morning, Emily sat at the kitchen table, the Bible open in front of her, the letter lying flat beside it. A notebook sat open, filled with scribbles and questions. The name Sarah appeared over and over, circled, underlined. Sarah, the woman who might have carried her father's secret. Sarah, the missing piece. Emily exhaled, gripping her pen. If she was going to carry the truth, she needed answers. Her first stop was the local church. She hadn't stepped inside since she was a teenager, but the moment she walked through the old wooden doors, the smell of polished wood and candle wax hit her like a flood. Memories pressed close, the sermons, the hymns, her father's stern face beside her in the pew. The church secretary, an older woman with kind eyes, greeted her. Emily explained that she was looking into her family's history, trying to learn about people connected to her father. The woman listened carefully, nodding before leading her to the archives, a dusty room filled with old records, handwritten notes, and fading photographs. Hours passed as Emily sifted through boxes. Baptism records, marriage registries, attendance logs. She found her father's name countless times, her mother's too. But it was when she found Sarah's name that her heart stopped. Sarah had been part of the same congregation for years. She was mentioned in women's group rosters, listed as a choir singer, even photographed at church picnics. Always there, always close. Emily traced her finger over the faded ink of Sarah's name. It was real. Her father hadn't lied. But then the trail grew colder. After a certain year, when Emily had been about 7, Sarah's name vanished from the records. No choir, no groups, no attendance. Just silence. Emily leaned back, frustration rising in her chest. Had Sarah left the church? Left town? Or had she been forced out when rumors spread? She needed more. The next day, Emily visited the town library. She searched newspaper archives, scrolling through brittle headlines on a dusty microfilm machine. She found fragments of gossip. A name mentioned here, a whispered scandal there. One article caught her eye, an announcement of a woman named Sarah moving away, her departure framed as a fresh start. No details, no explanations, just a line or two that left more questions than answers. Emily pressed her forehead against the glass of the screen, her stomach twisting. Each clue only deepened the mystery. Finally, she decided to track Sarah's home. With help from old property records, She drove to a quiet street on the edge of town. The house was small, weathered by time, the paint peeling from the shutters. Emily's breath caught as she stepped onto the porch. But when she knocked, no one answered. A neighbor, an elderly man tending his garden next door, paused to watch her. Emily introduced herself, explaining that she was looking for Sarah. The man frowned, his expression softening. "Sarah passed away years ago," he said quietly. "Cancer, it was a long time back." The words hit Emily like a blow. She stood frozen, grief rising in her chest for a woman she had never met, but who suddenly felt tethered to her life. But then the neighbor added something that made her pulse race. She had a child, though. A boy. Grew up here for a while before moving away. Michael, I think his name was. Haven't seen him in years, Michael. The name echoed in her mind like thunder. She thanked the man, her heart pounding as she walked back to her car. A child, a son. The truth was no longer just possibility. It was real. Her father's mistake had not vanished into silence. It had grown, lived, and walked the earth alongside her all these years. That night, Emily sat in her father's old study. The letter spread out before her again. She whispered the name aloud. Michael. The thought of him both terrified and unsettled her. Did he know? Did he have questions of his own? Did he even suspect that his absent father was the man who had raised her? Her hands tightened into fists. The fear in her chest was sharp. Fear of what she might uncover, fear of how it would change everything. But beneath the fear was determination. She couldn't leave this truth buried, not when it had already clawed its way into the light. She flipped open her notebook and wrote the name in bold letters across the page. Michael. This was no longer about her father's mistakes. It was about finding the one person who could give her the answers he had taken to the grave. Emily leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent again, but this time the silence felt charged, like the air before a storm. She didn't know where the search would lead. She didn't know if Michael would want to see her, or if he would even believe her story. But one thing was certain. She had crossed a line. There was no going back. The name stayed with Emily like an echo she couldn't silence. Michael. Every hour of every day, her thoughts circled back to him. What did he look like? Did he resemble their father? Did he even know the truth about his parentage? Or had it been buried, just as it had for her all these years? The search consumed her. She scoured social media, online records, old alumni lists, anything that might trace his life. At first, the trail was faint, an address here, a job posting there. Then, finally, she found him. A photograph appeared on her screen one evening. A man in his 30s, with eyes startlingly familiar. He was standing outside what looked like a community center, his arm draped around the shoulders of a group of young volunteers. His smile was wide, but something in his gaze, something quiet, guarded, pulled at her. Emily pressed her hand to her chest, struggling to breathe. This was real. This was him. The drive to meet him stretched endlessly. The road wound through gray autumn fields, trees stripped bare by the season. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She rehearsed what she might say, the words stumbling and rearranging in her mind. Nothing sounded right. At last, she arrived at the address she had pieced together. A modest townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. Lights glowed faintly through the curtains. For several minutes, she sat in her car, paralyzed, her pulse hammering. She considered turning back, retreating into the safety of ignorance. But she knew she couldn't. With trembling hands, she stepped out and walked to the door. Each step felt heavier than the last. When she knocked, the sound reverberated through her bones. The door opened. Michael stood there. For a moment, all Emily could do was stare. He looked so much like their father, it made her knees weaken. His height, the shape of his jaw, the shadow of weariness in his eyes. But there were differences, too. A gentleness, a humility, something softer than the stern presence she remembered from her father. Yes? His voice was cautious, polite. Emily swallowed hard. Are you Michael? He nodded, his brow furrowed. I am. Do I know you? Her mouth went dry. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. I think we're family. The silence that followed was unbearable. Michael blinked, confusion etched across his face. Family? What do you mean? Emily's throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue. My father was David Turner. I think he was your father, too. The change in Michael was immediate. His expression darkened, his jaw tightening. He stepped back, shaking his head. No, that can't be. My father, my mother, she never. His voice faltered. Emily pulled the folded letter from her bag, her hands trembling. She held it out to him like an offering. I found this after he died. It's his handwriting, his words. Please, just read it. Michael hesitated, staring at the paper as if it might burn him. At last, he reached out and took it, his fingers brushing hers briefly before pulling away. The silence stretched as he read, his eyes moving over the words that had shattered Emily's world. His face hardened, then softened, then broke entirely. When he finished, he lowered the letter slowly, his hands shaking. It's true, he whispered, more to himself than to her. I always wondered. My mother, she never spoke his name. She just said he was gone, that he didn't want us. His voice cracked on the last word. Emily's chest tightened with grief. For him, for herself, for the wreckage their father had left behind. I didn't know either, she said softly. Not until now. They sat together in silence for a long time, the weight of the truth pressing down on both of them. Michael's hands clenched the letter, his eyes distant. Do you have any idea, he said finally, his voice trembling with anger, what it's like to grow up believing you were unwanted? To see other kids with fathers and know yours chose not to be there? Emily's throat ached. I can imagine, she whispered. Because I grew up thinking my father was perfect. Stern, distant, but honorable. And now I know he wasn't. He lied to me. He lied to all of us. Michael's eyes met hers then, sharp and searching. So what now? Why are you here? The question pierced her. Why was she here? She hadn't known until this moment. But now, staring into the face of the brother she never knew she had, the answer rose in her chest like a tide. Because I don't want his mistakes to define us, she said quietly. We don't have to carry his silence anymore. We don't have to keep pretending. Michael's jaw tightened. His eyes glistened, though he tried to blink the tears away. You don't understand. You had him. You had his presence, his name, his protection. All I had was absence. I do understand, Emily said, her voice breaking. And that's why I'm here. Because maybe, just maybe, we can heal what he broke. Together. For a long time, he said nothing. The tension in the room thickened until Emily could barely breathe. Then, finally, Michael lowered his gaze, tears sliding down his cheeks. I don't know if I can forgive him, he whispered. You don't have to, Emily said gently. But maybe you can forgive yourself. And maybe, in time, we can forgive each other. They sat in silence again, but this time it felt different. Not the silence of emptiness, but the fragile quiet of something new being born, a beginning forged from ashes. Emily looked at him, her brother, a stranger, a mirror of everything she had lost and everything she had just found. And for the first time since finding the letter, hope flickered in her chest. The days after their first meeting were heavy with silence. Emily drove home that night in a fog, her body trembling as if she had carried a weight too large for her to bear. She had laid down the truth, but the truth itself was jagged. It cut her, and it had cut Michael even deeper. Still, she couldn't leave it there. Something in his eyes, pain, loneliness, the desperate hunger for belonging, stayed with her. She knew if she let the silence grow again, it might swallow both of them whole. So she reached out. Her first text was simple, hesitant. "I'm here if you want to talk." No reply. The second, "I'd like to meet again, if you're willing." This time, hours later, a single word appeared on her screen. Maybe. It was enough. They met at a small cafe in town, neutral ground where strangers and family could blur. The hum of quiet conversation and the hiss of an espresso machine filled the space, a shield for their unsteady words. Michael was already there when Emily arrived, seated at a corner table with a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. His posture was stiff, his arms crossed like armor. Emily approached slowly, unsure if she belonged. When he looked up, his expression was guarded, but not closed. That was something. She sat down across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "Thank you for coming," he shrugged. "Didn't know what else to do." For a while, they said nothing, the silence stretching between them like a fragile bridge. Then Michael broke it. "I read the letter again, over and over. Part of me wanted to tear it up, pretend it didn't exist." His jaw tightened. "But I can't, because it explains everything I never had the courage to ask my mother." Emily's chest ached. "I've been reading it too. It's the only thing that feels real about him now." Michael looked at her sharply. "Do you miss him?" The question startled her. She thought of her father's last days, his labored breaths, the wall of silence that had grown between them over years of distance. She thought of the anger she'd carried, the disappointment. Yet she also remembered moments of laughter, his hand steadying her bicycle, his quiet prayers at night. "Yes," she admitted softly, "and I hate myself for it, because I'm not sure who I'm missing. The man I thought he was, or the man he really was." Michael's eyes flickered with something she couldn't name. He looked away. "I don't have that luxury. All I ever had was a name without a face. And now that I have a face, it's already gone." His words cut her. But beneath them she heard the echo of her own pain. Loss was their common ground, even if shaped differently. They began to meet more often, cautiously, like people testing the strength of ice beneath their feet. Coffee turned into walks through the park, then long drives where conversation shifted from their father to themselves. Emily learned Michael loved music. He taught guitar to children at the community center. He spoke of it with a light in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Michael learned Emily was an editor, someone who spent her life fixing words because she couldn't always fix her own past. Sometimes their conversations flowed easily, filled with laughter that startled them both. Other times, silence dropped between them like a stone, reminders of the ghost that bound them. One evening, after a long walk, they paused on a footbridge over the river. The sun was setting, painting the water in streaks of orange and gold. Michael leaned against the railing, his expression thoughtful. "You know what makes me angry?" he said quietly. "That he stole our choice. He could have told us the truth, let us find each other years ago. But he kept us apart. And now we're here, trying to build something out of scraps." Emily's throat tightened. "I know, and I hate him for it. But maybe building from scraps is better than building from nothing." Michael looked at her, his eyes glistening. "Do you really believe that?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I have to. Because if I don't, then all we're left with is bitterness. And I can't live like that anymore." The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Less like distance, more like understanding. The bond between them was fragile, like a thread pulled from a frayed cloth. But it was there, and for the first time in years, Emily felt something close to hope. She didn't know if forgiveness would ever fully come. For their father, for herself, for the silence that had swallowed so much of their lives. But as she stood beside her brother, watching the river carry away the day's last light, she knew this. They had a chance, and sometimes a chance was enough. The cemetery was quiet that morning, the air cool and heavy with mist. Rows of headstones stretched across the hill, each one a marker of love and loss. secrets and truths buried beneath the earth. Emily walked slowly, the worn leather Bible clutched to her chest. Michael walked beside her, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his steps steady but hesitant. Neither spoke. Their silence wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of people carrying the same weight, the same fragile understanding. When they reached their father's grave, Emily stopped. The stone was simple, his name etched cleanly into the granite. David Turner, a father, a man of faith, a man who had carried a lie until his last breath. Emily's throat tightened. For weeks she had rehearsed this moment. But now, standing here, words seemed impossible. She knelt down, brushing her hand over the cold stone. Her eyes burned with tears she had not allowed herself to shed at his funeral. She opened the Bible, its pages worn, filled with underlined verses and fading notes. Carefully, she pulled out the folded letter, creased, yellowed, carrying the weight of all that had been hidden. Her voice trembled as she began to read aloud. Emily, my daughter, if you ever find this, know that I have carried regrets heavier than I could bear. I failed your mother. I failed you. And I failed the son who never knew me. I was a coward. But I loved you, both of you, more than I could ever say. Her tears fell freely now, dripping onto the stone. The words cut her, but they also softened something inside her. For the first time, she wasn't just angry. She was grieving, not just the father she lost, but the broken man he had always been. When her voice broke, Michael stepped closer. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his own eyes shining. That's enough, he whispered. But Emily shook her head. No, I need to finish. She read the last lines slowly, her voice raw. I pray that one day the truth will set you free, that you will find each other and forgive what I could not fix, that you will carry love forward, where I left only silence. When the final word slipped into the air, Emily folded the letter again. She pressed it to her lips, then laid it carefully inside the Bible. With trembling hands, she closed the cover and placed it gently on the grave. I'm leaving it with him, she said softly. It's where it belongs now, not hidden, not forgotten. For a long moment, she knelt there, her head bowed, and then, slowly, something shifted inside her. The bitterness that had clung so tightly began to loosen. The anger drained away, leaving sorrow, but also compassion. She stood, wiping her tears. For the first time in years, her chest felt lighter. Michael looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice low. I don't know if I'll ever forgive him, but I think I can live with knowing the truth. And maybe that's enough, Emily nodded. Forgiveness isn't for him, it's for us, so we can move forward. A quiet understanding passed between them. They were no longer bound only by a father's lie. They were bound by their choice to build something new out of the truth. As they left the cemetery, Michael fell into step beside her. He didn't speak, but when their shoulders brushed, neither of them pulled away. Emily glanced at him, a small, fragile smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was walking alone. The truth had shattered her world. But in its fragments, she had found something unexpected. A brother, a chance at healing, and the possibility of new beginnings. And as the morning sun broke through the mist, Emily felt it, the quiet, powerful peace of a changed legacy.